Yes, go ahead, Mr. Tim Schellberg. You have the floor. How I wish we have the same capability. But we are going to that level.
Oh yeah, no,
With the present
yeah.
PNP crime laboratories, how many? My point is, how do you do that in the United States? We have every police department
Sure.
has its own DNA laboratory. How do you centralize everything?
Sure. So we're different than your country because we have a state system. So what happens is it's in 3 levels. So in each state, like California, you would have the local crime lab, maybe at Los Angeles or San Francisco, and they do DNA, and then they forward it up to the state of California, which is the Department of Justice of California. They have the database at the state, and then they forward it up to the FBI in the Washington, D.C. area. And the same happens in Florida and Texas. That way, if you have a criminal that went in the database in California, but then he went to Texas and committed a rape, both would forward it to the FBI and they would get a match. And then the FBI would inform the states.
Because you have a different system of government.
Yes.
You have a federal form of government.
Yes.
Here in the Philippines, it's quite different because we have two national investigating agencies. We have the National Bureau of Investigation and we have the Philippine National Police. They are both national agencies.
Sure.
So
The way that, my opinion of how that would work, sir, is you would have your, obviously, the entity that's in charge of the database would control the hub, but each law enforcement agency, NBI, PNP, would have its own database and send it to the hub. So, for example, if the NBI is doing casework, you want to be able to share with the PNP's database. So they would have a workstation that they send up to the PNP.
yes, thank you for that input.
Yeah.
Again, the problem is TERP between the NBI and the PNP. That's given already because per the comments of the NBI from in their position paper, it seems that we need to harmonize everything. So anyway, that's not your problem. That's my problem.
Yes.
So thank you for that presentation.
Absolutely. Here.
How I wish we have the same capability, but we are going to that level.
Oh yeah, no,
With the present
yeah.
PNP crime laboratories, how many DNA laboratories do we have?
We have 3, sir. We have in our national headquarters, 1 in Cebu and in Davao, yung mega lab natin, sir.
So, ako, if somebody complains against me for siring a child, I don't need to go to Manila. I just go to Davao City DNA laboratory to prove that this child is not my son. So I don't have to support the mother of that child.
Yes, sir, as long as the needed samples are submitted to our DNA laboratories in Cebu or in Davao. Doon, sir, may examine na kung yung paternity question, sir.
Okay.
And this is the case of Marcos Tiguero. And in 2006, the Brazilian Congress was presented, next slide, Ms. Lorna. The Brazilian Congress was presented with legislation that would require the criminal database to be created, but they actually voted no. They didn't have the information to understand the value of the criminal database, and they voted no. That next year, this individual was released from prison in 2008, and because his DNA was not convicted, when he went back to his hometown and committed 5 rapes and murders, all 1 month apart, DNA at every crime scene, when they collected the first crime scene DNA and put it in the database, they didn't get a match. because they didn't take his DNA. So basically, if the Brazilian Congress would have passed the legislation in 2006, 4 out of those 5 rapes and homicides would have happened. And we actually know who they are. This is the first victim. Unfortunately, she would have died anyway. But all 4 of these other young women, one more click, Lorna, would have still be alive today if the Brazilian Congress would have passed that law in 2006. Now, when the families of all these people figured out that their daughters and wives and mothers could still be alive if that law passed, they went down to the Capitol in Brasilia, next slide. They worked with the Senate, they worked with the Congress, they worked with the president, and they quickly passed that bill so they could prevent more deaths in the future. So it's a very good story and a very good example. The next example, the reason why we have these databases is to exonerate the innocent. Again, imagine if you have these high hit rates, what happens? You find the criminal quickly with one test. That means that police don't have to investigate 10 or 20 more people. They don't have to question them. They don't have to make them feel uncomfortable. They don't have to arrest them falsely, as we know, even convict them falsely. And that's how these databases exonerate the innocent. And finally, Mr. Chairman, the main reason that we have these databases, they can actually save your government money. There's a number of studies throughout the world, and here's some from the United States that show, well, hold on that one there, Lorna, just up on deterrence. One more click. These studies show the savings to government. So this lady took 2 control groups. She found 2 control groups that were convicted of a crime. They weren't in prison. They were put out in the community even though they were convicted. One had DNA taken. One group did not have DNA taken. The groups with DNA were 42% less likely to commit another crime within a year because they were scared. They knew that if they did, they would be discovered because their DNA is in the database. So you can imagine how much savings occurs when you have 42% less crime by those individuals. Next click. The next study she looked at is what's the actual crime reduction every time you increase your database size by 10%. So let's say your law would have only gone to convicted criminals, but then you add arrestees and you you increase your database 10%. What's the impact on crime? And she found that every time you increase by 10%, you have 5% less murders, 6% less rapes, 8% less vehicle thefts. So clearly showing the link between database size by legislation and reducing crime. And finally, she looked at what's the social cost to crime? And she looked at things like when you're a victim of a crime, hospital bills, time out of work, property crimes, stuff you lose. And they calculated that for every time you add one person to the database, you're actually saving the citizens of the U.S. $20,000, or excuse me, the government of the U.S. $20,000. And so that she declared that in the United States in 2010, we added 761,000 criminals to the database. And by doing that, reducing the cost, we actually saved the government and the people of the United States over 15 billion, I think that says $15 billion. So you kind of get the point. And the next slide is another study I encourage your staff to research. It just looks at one state, the state of Indiana, which is next to Illinois, the city of Chicago area. And they found that by taking the legislation to all arrestees and by having that high hit rate, they actually saved the taxpayers of Indiana $60 million a year. So again, I encourage you to look at this data. This bill that you're passing can actually save your country money.
Excuse me. How about the Philippines? Do you have an estimate as to how much we are going to save if we're gonna legislate
I have not done that research.
DNA law?
Yeah, I haven't done that research, sir,
You
but I
have that?
encourage your staff to look at these studies and make
Okay,
comparisons. Yes. So to give you a little more background about the United States, as you may know, the first click, we'll go one by one, Ms. Lorna. It has become an essential part of our criminal justice system in the United States. It's run by the FBI, but it appears in every element of our system. Next slide, or click. We have 20 million offenders in our database. Next click. It's been operational since late 1990s. Next click. We have many, it's known the FBI has set up many standards and quality assurance standards that are available to the rest of the world to utilize. Our law, we have a state system unlike yours. Every state controls what goes into the database. All of our states, like your bill, requires everybody to be convicted to go in the database. Next click, but only 33 states require everybody convicted and arrested. Your legislation is everybody convicted and everybody arrested if they're charged, which means that our hit rate's going to be lower than yours when your database matures, because your bill goes a little further than the United States, and you'll be able to achieve these high hit rates. Our Congress quite hasn't gone to that level, or our states haven't. Next click. So we've been at this 20 years around the world. There were early adopters, like I said, the United Kingdom, United States, Australia, New Zealand. They basically led the way. There was a lot of data, like I just presented to you. And because of that, we now have 59 countries around the world that have passed this legislation like yours, sir, and have implemented it on somewhat of a national scale. And here are those 59 countries that have done this. In Asia, you can see, and I actually have Philippines and Thailand mentioned as having databases because you already do. You've had a PNP decree that set it up. You just don't have the legislation to legitimize it, and that's what your legislation will do. And the same goes for Thailand. But you have, the one thing you'll notice is that this past year alone, there's been this huge explosion of legislation throughout the world. More than these 59 countries want in on this. And here's the countries on the top line are countries that have introduced and passed legislation since COVID, creating the legislation or this program. And you notice that even in Ukraine, in the middle of the war, they actually passed legislation in their parliament and have begun implementation because they've visualized post-war that they're going to need a lot of human identification. And you can see I have Thailand and Philippines on here as you're actively looking to formalize your DNA programs today. Next slide. So the big question that members of your Senate and Congress have to look at around the world when they introduce this legislation is balancing the benefits to society of these databases and any concerns to privacy. Well, I've explained to you the benefits: solve, prevent, exonerate, and save. The privacy concerns you have to show are the benefits outweigh. But the big thing to see, if we go back to that click, Lauren, right there, this is the only thing going into the database, these 27 numbers. So what people think, next click, Lauren, and hold there, a lot of people think that the whole genome is going into the database, and that's why they get upset. But if you can explain to them that only those numbers are what goes into the database, not your genome, not anything that the government could look at for healthcare or anything like that, they start to see DNA as just like a fingerprint. It doesn't mean anything other than the ability to distinguish me from somebody else. And that's an important factor to deal. Some people will say, though, that, well, only the numbers go into the database, but the government still has your biological sample. And maybe the government could do something evil with that, like test you for insurance reasons and things like that. So a way that your bill, and you have this in your bill, to control for this is you destroy the biological sample after the profile is uploaded to the database. That protects privacy because then there's no threat that you can use that biological sample for something other than identifying people. Next slide. In addition to that, there's all these other things in your bill that allow for public privacy, like penalties upon misuse, giving the public trust they need to know that the police can manage an effective, privacy-conscious database. So with that, sir, I think I am, next click, I am done. I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm happy to be a resource to your team and providing information from around the world to make sure you have the best legislation that can solve crime, prevent crime, and exonerate the innocent. Thank you.